Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Philippines. Still here in Dumaguete, and I thought I'd talk about things that go bump in the dark. People always ask me, about marine animals, and was there a problem with them and that. And, actually, for the most part, there wasn't. I mean, sharks were not really the concern. When I worked in the Gulf of Mexico, normally the visibility was so bad. If there were sharks around you, you didn't have to worry about them because you couldn't see them. Hanging on a stage, which is basically just a platform in mid-water at night, we're doing decompression. Okay, never had any problems with sharks, but you feel like you're a worm on the end of a hook, sitting out there in the middle of nowhere in the ocean, hanging on a string, hanging off the side of a barge. But what would get you every once in a while was if you were swimming in somewhere where you'd run into something. And one of the ways that would happen is like doing pipeline work. When they put pipelines in the shallower regions, they all have to be buried. And that depth will depend on the company that's putting them in and where they're going at. So you've got one company that's contracted to install the pipeline, and then you have another company that comes behind that company checking to make sure that the pipe's at the proper depth and there's anodes on the pipe, and just some of these things that are part of the contract of the contractors who are installing the equipment. So what happens sometimes is you have to walk down this ditch, and it's basically, well, it is a ditch. It's a ditch that's been dug underwater and it has a pipe in it. Well, once that's in there and you're out on a sandy or mud bottom, that's the only structure for like big fish and things to go and hide in. So you're coming down that ditch and you're just sort of working along, and you're counting anodes and things that they want to know on the surface, and all of a sudden you bump into something and it's big. And it's like your heart will stop because you don't know what you've run into. And of course the animal that's in the ditch, which is typically a turtle or a big grouper of some sorts laying in the ditch, well, they're in there resting or sleeping. So, conditions the same for the animal that's there. It's like they're startled. They make a commotion getting out of there. Your heart rate goes up to 150, 200. The guys on the surface hear you gasp because we're all wearing helmets. So we've got communications with the surface at all time. That makes your heart stop. It really does. You're not expecting anything like that. You're just doing your job. And a lot of the diving I did, and a lot of the commercial diving in general, is done in pitch black. We basically work with our hands. We're blind men working underwater. But yeah, that's one of those moments of sheer terror that hits you just for a second, and you realize it swims away, and you catch your breath and you move on. Another thing is when I moved inshore, I started diving with alligators. Don't ask me why I did that. I didn't turn work down. Basically, the only work I would turn down is I refused to dive in sewage plants, and I refused to dive in nuclear reactors. Otherwise, if it was paying, I probably went and did it. So I was doing work for an inshore company, and we were doing bridge inspections in South Louisiana. And I don't know if you've been to South Louisiana, but it's full of alligators. There's never a shortage of them. So we were working with the Department of Natural Resources, and supposedly they were going into all these places and they were removing the big alligators, say over 10 feet. So that when we came in, there would be alligators on site, but there weren't supposed to be any really big alligators there. Little did any of us know that the little alligators are the ones that come and check you out, and the big ones have been hunted and molested over the years, so they normally give humans a wide berth, or at least they did 25 years ago. There's a lot more of them now. I'll talk about some of those in Florida. But I'm working on this job site, and we've got a guy there with a rifle, and I think he was from the Department of Natural Resources, but he assured us that, if any gators came close to us while we were in the water, he'd just shoot them. And okay, that's fair enough. You do your job, I'll do mine. So I hadn't been in the water maybe 10 or 15 minutes. First time I've dove with alligators. And divers are a bunch of practical jokers. It's a manly job. It's not for somebody that's faint of heart. We pull cruel jokes on each other all the time. And if you can't take it, you shouldn't be in the job. So I'm doing an inspection, and one of my buddies, they start talking to me on the radio, and they're going, well, I don't want you to get nervous, but there's an alligator swimming over to the pylon that you're on, and it's just coming out to check out your bubbles. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure, you know, these guys are pulling my leg. And they're going, nah, there's an alligator coming over. So I think it's a joke. So it's not that deep. I'm in 15 feet, 5 meters of water. I just shimmy my way up to the pile, and I crack my helmet out so I can see, because the water's black. And sure enough, I'm looking at an alligator that's maybe a meter away from me. I'm like, holy crap. And back down, and I'm like, shoot that thing, shoot that thing. Well, the guy from DNR is like, he never shot it. I was rather ticked off at him when I got out of the water. And he's gone, oh, that's just a small one. And small one being like 2 meters long, 6 feet. And honestly, an alligator that's 2 feet long is not like really big around yet. That's about the time they transition between 6 and 8 feet, where they really start to get some weight on them and start turning into a big boy. But he's like, nah, I didn't think it would bother you. And I'm like, yeah, but that wasn't your decision. Your decision when you showed up here was you told us if anything got around us, you'd shoot it. So I was a little bit unhappy with my first alligator diving. The other marine animals that were probably more of an issue to divers out in the Gulf were sea urchins and sometimes moray eels. The sea urchins, they got spines all over them, and again, we're working in the black. So we do everything with our fingers. That's how we feel our way around. We do navigate with our hose. Once you're diving long enough, you have an idea of where your hose is at and where the boat's at, and in your mind you can figure out where you're going. But we're using our hands for everything. And if you put your hand in the wrong spot and there's sea urchins in there, they go right through your glove. And it's one of those pesky things that's, your fingers are going to get infected from it, and you still have to work. You're out there doing that. And then occasionally guys would get bit by a moray. And morays are not aggressive, but around the oil rigs are often a bunch of tires laying on the bottom. And that's because the boats that service the oil industry use the tires as fenders on the boats. And they get ripped off. It's heavy seas, and they're up next to a platform or another boat, and it just shears them off, and they end up on the bottom. Well, that's a perfect home for a moray eel. They love the inside of those tires. So occasionally guys would get a bite or something from one of those, but when it came to big animals like sharks and that, they're just really not an issue. Crane operators, on the other hand, were very dangerous. And they went bump in the dark also. And that was because when you're working with the crane and you're on the land and they bring a load down and they stop, it just sits there. But if you're on a boat or a barge and there's any kind of waves, it's going up and down, the crane is, and that means whatever heavy equipment they have on the bottom is doing the same thing. So the procedure was, if there was a big heavy piece of equipment, they would set it on the bottom, and then you would go over and do whatever you were going to do with it. But if the crane operator had not left enough slack in the cable that was connected to it, and a big wave came in, all of a sudden, that load or that piece of machinery on the bottom could jump up. And I know quite a few guys that had their necks cracked, where a big piece of machinery came up and then just came down and pile drived them. And they ended up with getting their vertebrae fused, and I guess all that was probably pretty new in the 80s when they were doing it, but I ran into quite a few guys that had that type of an incident. Another interesting experience I had with things that went bump in the dark was I had the opportunity to do an inspection for NASA, and I think that's called the Banana River up in that part of Florida, but because NASA is such a secure area, the wildlife there is amazing. Nobody's in there. If you don't work for NASA, you're not anywhere near these docks and that we were going to work on. These were actually the docks where they brought in the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle. So we're in there and we show up at the job site and we're setting up all our equipment, and literally right in front of the seawall where we're going to be working, we see bottlenose porpoise, we see alligators, and we see manatees. And those are all big creatures. And literally at one point in front of us, we had all three animals within a 10-foot radius of each other. They're just moving back and forth through there, and they're feeding, and they're not afraid of anybody. I mean, there's nobody in there that bothers them. So I get down on the bottom, and you know, the manatees and the dolphins, the porpoise, I'm not worried about those. But boy, there's some big alligators in there. And again, by this time I've dove with alligators quite a bit. And to me, they're dinosaurs, right? They've got a brain about the size of your thumbnail, and they sleep and they eat and they have sex, and that's about the only thing they think of. So I'm always cautious diving with the alligators. So I jump in the water and I'm doing the inspection on the wall. Everything's going fine until something comes up behind me and just boom, hits me in the back and pushes me up face first into the seawall. Yeah, my heart rate went up on that one, because at first it's like, you know, what's attacking me? And as I twist around to defend myself, I find myself hugging a big old sea cow, a big old manatee. I think they call them gadoons or something like that over here in this part of the world in Asia. But bloody big animal. Gentle. I guess the ones over here aren't so gentle, but the manatees of South Florida are quite gentle. But oh my God, that was one of the scary things of running into a big animal, because most of the time when that happened, you would bump into something and it would be afraid and it would go one direction, and you know, you went the other way or just stopped and it swam away. But that one had come up, and I don't know if it intentionally came up to touch me and see what was there, but yeah, that one left me a little bit of a heart attack. Let me see, what other marine things? We had all kinds of experiences with stuff where working in that field, the practical jokes were something we got on each other all the time. If we could figure out how to put somebody in a situation and scare the hell out of them, we did. And OSHA has a lot of things that, you know, they require you to do now. And they had a lot of things that they required us to do when we were working back then. And some of the silly stuff was like, I was working on a construction project up in Fort Pierce, Florida. And I don't remember exactly what our projects were that we were doing, but the construction company had guys in the water, and like waist deep, and they're standing in there with big half-inch electric drills, and they're drilling holes in the piles. I'm watching them do this for a while, and I'm like shaking my head, and I said, guys are using, you know, 110 volt electric drills. And the guy that had the construction company goes, oh yeah, he's safe. You see the guy standing on the dock? He says he's his GFI, which is a ground fault interrupter, which separates electricity if, you know, you start to get shocked. And that was this guy's job. He would stand up there and hold the power cord. And if something went wrong, like you started to get electrocuted, his job was to disconnect it. Diving and electricity is something that I can't say I ever really enjoyed either. Everybody thinks of underwater welding, and I did some projects where we did underwater welding, but in general, you don't really do stuff underwater and put it together welding. They do some deep stuff where they call them a subsea tie-in, and they'll build a habitat around a pipeline, and they'll send down a professional welder who is also a diver. And he'll go in that habitat and he'll perform real welding. But typically most of the underwater welding is just used to secure anodes, do a patch. It's normally, it's patching type stuff. It's not really structural stuff. But what we do a lot of is burning. And burning involves cutting steel, and the technique, it's probably still the same, that was very popular, was something we called a Broco rod. And a Broco rod had I believe it was 7 filaments in it, if I remember right. But once you got it ignited and you blew oxygen through it, it would stay lit. And if I remember right, when it was, the electricity was going to it, and we had welding machines on the surface that were open wide up, as much amperage as we could get out of them. And once you take that welding rod and strike it against the metal, just like if you were trying to weld something, it would ignite that rod. And if we left the electricity on, it would burn at like 10,000 degrees. I mean, it will cut through stuff. You can actually get it lit off of a plate and start gouging concrete and going through the concrete. So in dive school, they had us wearing all kinds of rubber and then rubber gloves, like same thing you wash your dishes with. And I always got shocked. I guess I'm just sensitive to electricity. And I think pretty much every job I ever did, I was getting shocked. And when you work in warm water in the summertime, it's like we didn't wear rubber. We wore rubber work boots, a pair of coveralls, rubber gloves, and then our helmets. And I always got stray electric current coming through me. I was on one project, it got so bad I started wearing a football mouth guard because I had heard that it's possible to get enough juice that if you have silver amalgam fillings, which I had at the time, you can actually weld those together, and then you've got a real problem. But yeah, I would get shocked everywhere I worked with cutting, and I did a lot of burning. It's just something you do a lot of. I was involved in removing platforms in the early 80s. Those had to be chopped up. Throughout, anytime you're removing things, you're in there burning. I was involved on the Skyway Bridge down in Tampa, Florida. Involved in removing all the pilings and the jetties that were built for the original bridge that they had a accident with a ship back in, I guess, the early 80s. So later on in the early 90s, they were removing all that. And we'd go out to these big bases that were all made of concrete, and we'd use explosives and just basically shatter all the concrete. And what were left were 14-inch, half-inch or maybe 5-inch thick H-beams. And it would look like a sea of spaghetti there. Well, one of the rules for burning underwater is you keep the ground cable out in front of you, and you never get between that welding rod or that cutting rod and that ground cable that goes up to the welding machine. Well, the guy that was running that job, which was a barge superintendent, he's like, yeah, you guys don't need to do that. And he says, we'll just weld the ground cable to the barge. And he says, the barge will become ground, and every time we pulled these piles, we would go down with a crane and punch a hole in the top and hook the crane up to it, so that as we cut the bottom of these things off, and they were 10 or 15 foot tall, the crane already had them, and the crane would become our ground. Well, yeah, that worked real well, because as you moved around, you inevitably got between basically the barge and where you were cutting. And that job I was on for months, and I was electrified every day. That was just, but it's just part of the job. So everybody was doing it. Everybody was getting shocked. And yeah, we basically broke all the rules, and that was quite common again. OSHA existed back then, but nobody really stuck to the rules. So those are just some of the fun things of commercial diving. I was thinking this morning, I've got a friend of mine, Bill. He's a saturation diver, or was a saturation diver, and saturation is the guys who live in the tank. Now he's got some stories, and he's done some real deep diving, well over 600 feet, and he now pays for it. He can't get his arms up too much. And I originally wanted to get into saturation diving. That was one of the reasons I went to Singapore when I went to Singapore. And now I look back on it and I see what some of the problems these guys have, and I consider myself very fortunate that didn't happen. So anyway, I'm going to cut it short on that video. Just a little bit of fun of commercial diving and things that go bump in the night, or actually bump in the dark, because we were working in the dark all the time. Anyway, everybody have a good day. I'm in a much better spot today. I'm no longer in the cemetery. Got a little bit of overcast skies here, and that's the island of Sigahor out there off of Dumaguete. So anyway, until next time, have fun in the dark. Cheers.